In state legislatures across the United States, lawmakers are introducing bills that some believe are designed to give privilege to Christianity in public schools. These developments are seemingly part of a larger movement that has touched off a fresh debate over separation of church and state. In fact, in January of this year, a Republican state representative in Oklahoma filed a bill that would have required schools to hang the Ten Commandments in classrooms. Last week, a similar bill was approved by the Republican-led Louisiana House of Representatives. The Oklahoma bill appears to have died before the start of the state's legislative session, but the Louisiana legislation is now pending in that state's Senate. Both bills are part of a trend that's happening across the country, particularly in Texas, which is where we will focus our conversation today. With me is David Brockman, a non-resident scholar at the Baker Institute and professor at Texas Christian and Southern Methodist Universities. From the Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, I'm Ed Emmett, a fellow at the Baker Institute, and this is Baker Briefing. David, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You've just written a new report on legislative threats to church-state separation in Texas schools, so you've been following these trends very closely. But before we get into your findings, help us understand a term that we're seeing in headlines, Christian nationalism. David, exactly what is Christian nationalism?
Yes, that's an excellent question. This is a phenomenon that, of course, has received, as you say, has received a lot of coverage. I've been studying Christian nationalism on a scholarly basis since 2014. It's been 10 years now since I started looking at it, and there were others before me who kind of pioneered the study of Christian nationalism. And we were kind of working out in the desert for a while, people asking us, what is this thing that you're writing about? We don't see it, etc. Well, of course, that's changed in recent years. And the upside, of course, is that there's increased attention to this important subject, what we think is an important subject. The downside is that the term, because it's being used by so many different people, has, as the coverage has increased, the term itself, the meaning of the term has become less clear over time. As I use it, the kind of shorthand, the shorthand definition that I use in this report that we're talking about is that Christian nationalism is an ideology that seeks to privilege conservative Christianity in education, law, and public policy. I have a more expansive definition that I think is the one that I prefer, and that is that in its fuller form, as expressed by people, Christian nationalists like David Barton or Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Dallas, Christian nationalism contends that our nation's founders intended the U.S. to be an explicitly Christian nation governed by Bible-based laws. And secondly, that the U.S. has drifted away or departed from the founders' intent, and that Christianity, typically an evangelical version of Christianity, should determine our laws today. So that's, I think in its fullest form, that's what Christian nationalism is. It's not just advocating for a law or policy on Christian grounds. It's the question is privileging a particular religion, a particular version of a religion in education, law, and policy.
Well, you know, there's an old saying that two things you don't want to talk about at the dinner table are religion and politics, and we're going to talk about both of them today.
That's right. I make that joke early in my religion and politics course at TCU as well. So. So before we focus on Texas, let's talk about the tradition of church-state separation in the United States more broadly. You know, I grew up and went to public schools back in the 1950s and 60s, particularly in a smaller town. There were prayers before football games that always ended in Jesus' name. Mm-hmm. Best I remember, there were the Ten Commandments on our wall at the elementary school. We had blue laws, you know. I remember them well.
Yes, commercial enterprises had to close on Sunday, and those all reflected a certain Christian viewpoint. And so we'll get to this later, but, you know, a lot of people are saying just what you said, are we getting away from what the founding fathers intended? And to reflect back on that, What does the Constitution say about religion, and how has the U.S. Supreme Court viewed church-state separation throughout our history?
Okay.
And I know that could be the subject of hours of conversation, but in a brief way, how do you
Right.
describe?
This is a very complicated topic, and I spend a couple of weeks on this subject. So I'll try to boil it down as best I can. First of all, on church-state separation, the concept itself, you're likely to get, well, in fact, I know you'll get a very different view from some other voices in the conversation. I've mentioned David Barton and Pastor Jeffress. So I would encourage people to go seek them out and see what they have to say about church-state separation. They tell a quite different story from the one that I'm going to tell. My sources are many sources, many scholarly sources, academic historians and political scientists, generally speaking, constitutional scholars. Principally, the textbook that I use at TCU is by the political scientists Kenneth Wald and Allison Calhoun Brown. It's Religion and Politics in the United States. It's now just 8th edition. And then there's another book that I think is quite helpful, but is a little wonky, but might be of interest to some of our listeners. And this is by Stephen K. Green, who's a historian, and it's called Inventing a Christian America. Came out in 2016, and it covers the period of the founding and the period just after the founding, the second generation of the founding as well, and talks about how the notion of a Christian America came into being, at least from one historian's point of view. So I'm drawing on this more academic, historical, and political science research. First of all, as David Bradley, a Republican who was on the State Board of Education for many years, liked to say, he used to challenge folks to, he'd hold up a $100 bill and he'd say, I have a $100 bill here, and I'll give it to anyone who can find the words separation of church and state in the Constitution. And of course, I'm sure he never lost that $100 bill because those words are not in the Constitution, can't be found there. However, it's a widely recognized principle, constitutional principle, similar principle like separation of powers or federalism or checks and balances. None of those are in the Constitution either, but we recognize that they're there, that the Constitution reflects them. The term itself comes from Thomas Jefferson, our third president and the main author of the Declaration of Independence, who talked about a wall of separation between church and state. Now, the story you just told about Christianity and public life and so forth back in the 50s and 60s, I'm around the same age, and I grew up also in public schools in the 1960s. There was my 6th grade teacher handed out New Testaments in class during instructional time, and we would open many sessions with prayer and Bible readings, which at the time was probably in violation of Supreme Court decisions that we'll talk about in a minute. But it, I was there. So, but one thing about that period is that Christianity was demographically very dominant in the culture. So Protestants, Catholics, and Jews as a small minority, not nearly as religiously diverse as today. So let me go ahead and move to what the Constitution has to say. The Constitution itself establishes what Wald and Calhoun Brown call a secular state with no official religious identity, but generally friendly toward religion. And that includes freedom of religious expression, for example. Also, no competition from an official state religion, and no taxation, as it came out originally, not in the Constitution, but the tax-exempt status of religious organizations. And we can find the church-state separation in 3 places in the Constitution. One is in Article 6 of the Constitution, and that's the prohibition on religious tests for public office, that is having to, a candidate for public office having to affirm particular religious beliefs in order to hold public office. And then, probably more importantly, the two religion clauses in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, which says the government cannot establish a religion, usually interpreted as not setting up an official religion or endorsing a particular religion over others. And secondly, the Free Exercise Clause, which prohibits the government from interfering with the free exercise of religion. And these clauses in the Constitution set up that secular state, which basically, by not declaring an official religion, sets up what James Madison envisioned. Of course, the Constitution, one of the prime authors of the Constitution, envisioned as a kind of free marketplace of religions, where there would be competing religious visions, and no one religious group would dominate the others. And I regard that as one of the genius moves of the Constitution. One of the things we can really be thankful for in the Constitution, because it has allowed the United States to avoid a lot of the religious wars that the founders had in mind. It happened in the 1600s in Europe, and also has allowed for the nation to become much more religiously diverse than it was at the time of the founders, or even at the time you and I were in public schools, for that matter.
Well, talking about the Constitution is one thing, but the reality is we live in a political world, and frequently the politicians, the policymakers, they do what society promotes, and
right.
Sometimes it gets checked by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So let's move to the political landscape here in Texas. And again, a little bit of background. Certainly in Texas, well, I'll speak for myself. In 1979, I went to the Texas House of Representatives. There were 24 Republicans and 126 Democrats in the House at the time.
Yeah.
The parties were quite different.
Mm-hmm.
What we now term the religious right was pretty much Democrat, not only in Texas, but in the South.
Right.
That began to change under President Reagan. But in 1988, when Pat Robertson ran in the Republican primaries, suddenly a lot of churches got very involved in the Republican Party. And then the abortion debate came along, and abortion switched the parties around a little bit. We don't want to get into all those subjects, but now you have a Republican-dominated legislature, and you write about 3 specific bills that would give privilege to conservative Christianity in schools. What were those bills, and where do they stand?
Yes, the 3 bills that for me raise the most issues regarding separation of church and state, that I argue would tend to undermine church-state separation as reflected by the Constitution, as we talked about before, and also upheld by the Supreme Court. I didn't talk about the different interpretations and rulings by the Supreme Court. We might talk about that later if you'd like. But the 3 bills from the 88th legislature, Texas legislature, were Senate Bill 1515, which was the 10 Commandments bill. So I'll talk about that as the 10 Commandments bill. Second was Senate Bill 763, the school chaplains bill. And the third was the one that I'm sure everybody heard about during the regular session and the special sessions, and is still hearing about today, and that's Senate Bill 8, which was the voucher bill, the school choice bill, so on, depending on your position, I guess. The 10 Commandments bill would have required a specific version, a specific text of the 10 Commandments, which of course is a text from the Jewish and Christian biblical tradition, to be displayed in all Texas public school classrooms. And that bill passed the Senate, but then it died in the House. I don't think it ever came to a vote of the full House. As I was just checking on that today. So it basically died in the House. The second is the school chaplains bill. The school chaplains bill did pass the Senate and the House and was signed into law by Governor Abbott. So it's now the law of the land here in Texas. And that bill allows public school districts to employ chaplains who are religious clergy. Basically, they're members of a particular, representatives of particular religious denominations or religions, to provide counseling services in public schools. And then the third bill was the so-called voucher bill, Senate Bill 8, and of course that would have established a system of voucher-like education savings accounts, ESAs, that would allow parents to use taxpayer dollars to send their children to private schools, including religious schools, religious private schools. And that voucher bill, of course, probably most in the audience know, passed the Senate several times, but it failed in the House. It hit its greatest opposition in the House due to a coalition, really, of rural Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives that stayed firm throughout the various special sessions as well.
Okay. I won't ask you to look into the future and determine whether those bills are going to pass or not. But
right.
Those are three bills that, particularly the voucher bill, is going to keep coming back, and
yes.
the public does need to get engaged. I think it's we should also point out that school vouchers started a long time ago.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But they didn't have the religious school component.
No, they didn't. That's true.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes people mix those two. Well,
right.
You know, we're living in a nation where we keep hearing that religion is on the decline. Mm-hmm. And so Christian nationalism has been able to make inroads, even though people who say they go to church on a regular basis, that number continues to decline in the United States. Do you think many people support Christian nationalism, but they really think that Christianity is under assault, and so this is their way of pushing back?
I believe that's true. Most of the studies that I've seen, and this is Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead in their work, and they're going. By the way, they're going to appear at the upcoming seminar in Christian nationalism at Baker Institute next week. Or I'm sorry, on the 26th. I don't know when this is appearing, but they and also the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, has come out with a more recent study of who affiliates with Christian nationalism, who supports it, and PRRI found that their finding was that about 10% of Americans strongly support Christian nationalism, and another 19% support it somewhat, have some level of support with it. They found that PRRI study, again, this was from 2023, I believe, they found that it's largely a white evangelical Protestant phenomenon. About 2/3 of white evangelicals support Christian nationalism. Support was far weaker among other religious groups. And furthermore, Christian nationalists skew older. The PRRI study found that among Americans over the age of 50, 1/3 of those support Christian nationalism, whereas Americans under 50, the 18 to 49, about 70% oppose it. So it's stronger among older Americans as well. And I think part of the Whitehead and Perry, the PRI study, and others have suggested that it is a reflection. Christian nationalism is a reflection of especially white evangelical sense that that the previous dominance of Christianity in the society and perhaps in government as well is waning somewhat. That they're losing some dominance, and Christianity itself is losing dominance. And Christian nationalism offers the hope, I think, that that traditional dominance of Christianity in culture and politics can be maintained, even as the society grows much more religiously diverse than it was when I was a kid, for example. So I think it does appeal. It in a way, it might be kind of like an attempt to hold back the tide, the demographic tide, but that's my sense. And of course there are people. I mean, there are Christian nationalists who sincerely believe that the founders really did intend this to be a Christian nation, and that we have drifted away from their intent. So I don't want to diminish that that sincere belief on the part of many Christian nationalists. I don't agree with it, but that's for historical reasons. So I don't want to discount their opinion on that.
Well, this is a topic we could talk about for a long time, but let's wrap up with one last question. Do you sense an inevitability of this trend continuing, or I am going to ask you to look into the crystal ball. How's this going to end? Because you just mentioned a lot of the support is coming from older people, and that may change.
That may change. I think this is of course, American politics, hard to predict. Back in 1979, for example, it would be hard to predict the rise of Donald Trump in the Republican Party, for example. But and also the sorting out, the gradual trend to the left of the Democratic Party and the trend to the right of the Republican Party, that would have been difficult to predict as well. But I think that the demographics are really working against Christian nationalism, whatever its merits or its downside. I think that the demographics are working against it. One of the major developments right now over the past 2 decades is the growth of religiously unaffiliated Americans. Their numbers are up to over 25% now, and the percentage was much lower just 2 decades ago. So we have a quarter of the population who are not religiously affiliated. Doesn't mean they're not religious or that they don't have spiritual beliefs or that kind of thing, a spiritual life, but they don't affiliate with any particular religious group. That seems to be growing quite a bit, and the religiously unaffiliated tend to oppose Christian nationalism. Also, the white evangelical population is generally on the decline. And Christianity itself has declined. It represents around 67% of the population today. Just a few years ago, it was around 70%. And of course, back in the days of the founders, Christianity would have accounted for over 90% of Americans at the time. So this is a kind of gradual decline, and I think that I expect that Christian nationalism may actually become more, that is, Christian nationalists may become more active as a response to that declining influence. So we may see it for quite a longer time, but it may also decline kind of on its own, just because it no longer has the support among younger Americans. We'll have to see how that goes.
David, this is a fascinating topic, and we're certainly glad you're monitoring it and opining on it as we go. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Karina Zimmel. AV production is led by Kevin Young. Our interns are Rice University students Riley Barker, Gray Beaubien, and Maria Morcus. To learn more about our work, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for listening.